In a limestone cave in central Israel, archaeologists found something that did not belong. Beside the skeleton of an infant, dead before it ever learned to walk, lay a string of seashells. Not local shells. Shells carried from a coastline days away on foot, passed hand to hand, or carried in a single long journey by someone who had a reason strong enough to make that trip. The child died roughly 12,000 years ago, before farming, before writing, before anything we would call civilization. Someone took the time to find those shells, to thread them, to lay them beside a body too small to have earned them. This was not decoration. This was grief, frozen in stone for 12,000 years. And that grief raises a question most people never think to ask. How did ancient humans even try to stop this from happening? Because here is the part that should stop you cold. For most of human history, somewhere close to a third of children never survived past early childhood. Not in one unlucky tribe. Almost everywhere, across continents, across thousands of years, regardless of how advanced or simple the surrounding culture was. Bioarchaeologists studying ancient skeletons have found women dying in their 20s at rates that line up disturbingly well with the dangers of childbirth itself. Infants who survived birth still faced a wall of death in the first weeks of life, when their immune systems were weakest and the margin for error was almost non-existent. This was not the exception. For thousands of years, this was simply what being a parent meant. It did not matter if you were the child of a farmer in the Nile Valley or a hunter following herds across the steppe. Cold winters killed infants through exposure. Dry seasons killed them through contaminated water and failed harvests. Even small environmental shifts, a flood that ruined stored grain, a drought that dried up a mother's milk supply through malnutrition, could tip the scale between survival and death for a child who had no defenses of their own. Ancient communities understood this danger long before they understood why it happened, and entire seasonal rituals, harvest blessings, rain ceremonies, fire festivals, were quietly entangled with the unspoken hope of simply keeping children alive through the next hard stretch of the year. So what did people do about it? They did not just grieve, they built systems. In ancient Egypt, medical papyri like the Ebers papyrus mix real herbal remedies with incantations meant to ward off hostile spirits threatening a newborn. Some prescriptions called for specific plant extracts applied to the umbilical area, a genuine attempt at infection control centuries before anyone understood what bacteria even was. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets describe rituals against a demon called Lamashtu, believed to specifically hunt pregnant women and infants in the dark. Think about that for a second. An entire culture built protective magic around the specific fear of losing a baby in the night. In Greece and Rome, physicians like Soranus of Ephesus insisted that newborn limbs needed to be bound tightly, swaddled straight, or the child would grow crooked. Soranus also wrote detailed instructions on selecting wet nurses, judging their health, their temperament, even the color and consistency of their milk. Treating infant survival as something that could be studied and optimized, not just prayed for. Wealthy families hired wet nurses, and surviving contracts from Roman Egypt show exactly how structured this system was. Payment, terms, expectations, all written down for women feeding children that were not their own. For families without that wealth, survival often depended on a grandmother's memory of which herbs worked and which ones did not. Knowledge passed down so informally that almost none of it survives in writing today, only in the fact that some lineages continued and others did not. But here is where the story stops being simple. In several ancient cultures, including parts of Greece and later medieval Europe, families sometimes deliberately delayed naming a newborn, not for days, sometimes for weeks. Historians studying this have a theory that should make you uncomfortable. It may not have been neglect. It may have been protection for the parents, a culturally built buffer so that if the child died before the naming, before full acceptance into the family, the grief might be slightly more survivable. Some scholars point to similar delayed integration customs recorded in other traditional societies studied by anthropologists, where a child was not formally mourned with the same intensity as an older relative, not because the loss mattered less, but because the community had built emotional armor around a wound it knew it would have to absorb again and again. Imagine living in a world where loving your child fully, immediately, was considered a risk to your own sanity. That is not primitive thinking. That is a society organizing itself around an unbearable statistic. This knowledge did not stay in one place either. It moved. Swaddling shows up from ancient Peru to medieval Japan to early modern Europe, each culture inventing its own version of the same desperate logic, often without any direct contact between them, which tells you something important. This was not one idea spreading. This was the same problem producing the same solution, independently, again and again. Because the underlying fear was universal. Protective amulets crossed the Mediterranean, absorbed into new religions as they crossed borders, the symbol changing while the fear underneath stayed exactly the same. When Rome expanded, it carried its own medical texts into conquered lands and absorbed local infant remedies from Egypt, from Gaul, from the Near East, in return, building a patchwork of inherited desperation disguised as imperial medicine. For a long time, historians assumed these rituals were just superstition, disconnected from anything real. Then, archaeologists found proof otherwise. At Roman era sites in Britain, infant skeletons have been found buried beneath house floors and doorways, not in cemeteries. Some researchers believe this was deliberate, a way of keeping a child's spirit inside the protective boundary of the home, because full burial rites were often reserved for those who lived long enough to be fully counted as part of the community. In Egypt, amulets shaped like the god Bes, protector of children and mothers in labor, appear again and again in graves and in homes. Sometimes worn directly on infants, the figure's grotesque, almost comical face, believed to frighten away the very spirits parents feared most. And then there is the strangest evidence of all, written directly into bone. Using isotopic analysis, a method that reads chemical traces locked into teeth and skeletons, scientists have traced how long ancient mothers breastfed. The answer, in many populations, is 2 to 3 years. Far longer than most modern guidelines suggest. Why? Because the evidence suggests prolonged breastfeeding offered crucial immune protection during exactly the window when children were dying the most. Mothers may not have known the biology, but they knew the outcome. And they adjusted accordingly, generation after generation, refining behavior through observation long before anyone had a word for antibodies. Here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. Some burial sites show infants positioned with unusual care, wrapped tightly, sometimes alongside toys far too advanced for a child that young to have ever used. Archaeologists believe these were not gifts for the dead child as it was. They were gifts for the child as the parents imagined it would have grown to be. A doll for a girl who never spoke. A small tool for a boy who never walked. Grief reaching forward into a future that was stolen, refusing to accept that the story was already over. Modern people like to assume ancient parents were somehow emotionally distant from their children, hardened by how common death was. The evidence says the opposite. The careful burials, the protective rituals, the wet nurse contracts, the medical texts devoted entirely to childhood illness. None of that looks like detachment. It looks like obsession, in the best possible sense. Ancient parents were not naive about death. They were strategists, using every tool available, herbal, ritual, social, biological, to tilt the odds even slightly in their child's favor, knowing full well that the odds might not move at all. The strangest part is not that ancient people fought this hard to save their babies. The strangest part is how much of that fight modern people quietly inherited without realizing it. Swaddling, once justified by beliefs about crooked limbs, is recommended by pediatricians today for a completely different reason: soothing infants and reducing certain sleep risks. Prolonged breastfeeding, once driven by instinct and ritual, is now backed by immunology that confirms exactly what those ancient bones already suggested. Even something as modern as a baby monitor is just the latest version of an ancient fear. The terror of silence in the dark. The need to know your child is still breathing. Parents today still instinctively check a sleeping infant's chest for movement. A gesture with no formal name, passed down through pure repetition. Exactly the same motion a parent in a Bronze Age village would have made by candlelight. We did not invent the fear of losing a child. We inherited it, fully formed, from every parent who came before us and refused to look away. Every safety device, every pediatric guideline, every modern ritual around birth, baby showers, naming ceremonies, the first photograph, carries a faint echo of that older, harder world, where none of those celebrations could be taken for granted until enough time had passed to prove the child would stay. Back in that limestone cave, the shells are still exactly where they were placed, 12,000 years ago. They were never about beauty. They were a message sent forward through time without anyone intending it to travel that far. Proof that someone fought for this child, and that even in failure, the fight was worth remembering in bone and stone. Every parent checking on a sleeping baby tonight is doing the same thing, standing guard against silence, refusing to let go without trying everything they had.